Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us here for another Mackinac Center event. Today we are talking Michigan taxes, potential increases and reforms in 2021. So before we go into our event and talk to our panelists, I'm Jarrett Skorup. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications here at the Mackinac Center. If you don't know us, we are a free market research and educational institute located in Midland, Michigan. Before we go into the event, the description, and introducing our panelists, I'd like to first introduce our president, Joseph Lehman. Joe Lehman, an engineering by training, joined the Mackinac Center in 1995 and became president in 2008. During his tenure, Michigan has seen numerous free market policy advances in education, labor, and fiscal affairs. He's been frequently published in national and state media, and has trained more than 600 policy executives internationally on strategic leadership and communications. He and his wife are founders of the Midland County Habitat for Humanity. So before we start our event, Joe, take it away.
Thanks, Jared, and good morning and Happy New Year to Mackinac Center friends and supporters. This is probably the most interesting time in the public policy world in a long time, in my memory. And this is actually one of the benefits of an organization like the Mackinac Center that is designed to focus on state policy and not as much federal policy. And the reason that's a benefit right now is there are, everywhere you turn, there are massive distractions at the federal level. And although those are important, we remember where our leverage is, and that is at the state level. And I want to update you on some recent highlights that you may want to look at. Of course, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. We're still in the middle of a lockdown. Michigan's lockdown policies are among the most severe in the country. The Mackinac Center continues to be that voice that asks the question, are we getting as much benefit from the lockdowns as we are harmed, because we know there are real harms out there. But one of the things that's happening with the new legislature is we're hearing voices from the newly seated House members that they expect to be kind of tough on negotiating the budget with Governor Whitmer. Of course, the House and Senate, they do control the purse strings. It's the governor's job to sign budgets, and the House has indicated that they will be seeking some reforms to the lockdown policies in order to negotiate on the budget. So that's kind of a change from what we've seen over the last several months regarding the budget and the lockdowns. The Mackinac Center has just released a new research paper on flex learning. And what our proposal, written and developed by Ben DeGros, would do is it would simply allow any public school student in Michigan to take a course or a program at any other public school. And it would further allow the billions of dollars Michigan spends on public education, it would further allow that money to follow the child instead of just funding systems and buildings. Also, we are involved in litigation. We have several cases, but one of special interest in Michigan is a lawsuit against Michigan State University that fired its vice president for research, Stephen Shue. And the firing, we wanted some details that should have been available in public documents about what was behind that firing. And even though the university told us that it would only cost about $230 worth of staff time and 6 hours, 6 months later, we don't have the information that belongs to the public. So we've had to sue them over that, and we'll keep you updated on how Michigan State is being an open and transparent steward of our tax dollars. There are one area we are watching at the federal level is federal labor policy. And with the change in the U.S. Senate, with now more than likely effective control of the Senate going to the Democratic Party, this means that there are some rather bad labor ideas that could advance in the Senate. Now, the good news is not all Democrats want to go along with all of those ideas, but still, we'll be making sure that our hard-fought gains on things like right to work in Michigan and things like educating workers on their rights to leave a union across the whole country, that those rights are preserved and can be executed. We still are active in several states, communicating with workers in those states, letting them know that if they work for a government entity, they don't have to pay dues to a union anymore. And since we began that work, somewhere in the neighborhood of 16, 17% of the people we've been reaching have said no thanks to the union. And this means the unions will have to really work to earn those dues dollars. I want to briefly conclude my remarks here just by saying if you're from Michigan, you should be really proud of the work that Betsy DeVos has done in the Federal Department of Education as Education Secretary. She took a tough job. It's a big job, but it's a job with limited power. And again, my colleague Ben DeGrow has done some very nice writing on summarizing some of her accomplishments under difficult conditions. We don't ever remember a cabinet member being so opposed by entrenched interests. And it seemed that it was an example of no good deed going unpunished because Betsy DeVos has given a big chunk of her vocational energies in her adult life to expanding educational opportunities for kids. So I encourage you to check that out. And I want to thank you too. In this new year, we at the Mackinac Center are grateful for friends and supporters who we know we can count on through thick and thin. These are tough times for the country, tough times for the state. And it's now more than ever that we have to look to our founding principles, and we have to look for the areas that we all as Americans agree on to really entrench a new spirit of civic virtue. So, Jarrett, I'll turn it back over to you for the rest of the show.
All right, thanks, Joe. So before we get started here, a few minor logistical things. So this will be a moderated Q&A where I'll ask the panelists some questions, and then you can submit your own questions, and we'll have them answer those. So to do so, if you look, you'll have a Q&A box. Just click on that, submit questions, and then once we get to that portion, we will be picking some questions from there and asking it to the panelists. So today we're talking Michigan taxes. This is about potential tax increases as well as reforms in 2021. And we've got two great panelists for this. So James Homan and Janelle Kamanga. So James will focus mostly on what's going on in the state of Michigan. Janelle also knows a lot about Michigan and can talk about some of the federal changes that have happened that we can expect. So at the beginning of the last legislative term, Governor Gretchen Whitmer proposed a large tax hike, a 45-cent tax increase per gallon of gas. Some state and local officials are now using potential revenue loss from the COVID-19 crisis also as a reason to raise taxes. So these interests to hike taxes are now meeting with a new legislature, which has a new agenda. And these taxation levels will surely be a hot topic in 2021. So as I mentioned, we'll be hearing from Janelle Kamanga and James Homan. Janelle is a policy analyst with the Tax Foundation's Center for State Tax Policy. Before joining the team, she interned at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, the Reason Foundation, and the Illinois Policy Institute. Now graduated from Dordt College with a bachelor's degree in English, with a writing emphasis and a minor in chemistry, classic path that leads you to doing tax policy. And Janelle was born and raised in Michigan. James Homan is the Director of Fiscal Policy at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He's been reading and writing about Michigan fiscal policy since 2002. He holds a degree in economics from Northwood University in Midland, Michigan. All right, thanks for joining us, both of you. So first, I'm going to start off with James. How did COVID-19, how did the pandemic affect Michigan's tax revenue here in the last year or in the current fiscal year?
So it affected tax revenue a lot less than we expected last spring. So back in May, our administrators thought that the state was going to lose 12% of its revenues in that single year. And when they met again in August, they thought, well, maybe 3%. And this most recent estimation from last week, they said, well, actually revenue last year increased a little bit, which meant that they were budgeting on money that, or on less money than they thought, which means they have a lot more fund balance this year to spend if they want. So if you look at the reasons for why Michigan's revenue was so robust, it can make sense. So the largest tax in Michigan is the property tax. Property values are up. Construction did get halted, and that matters a lot to property tax revenue. But overall, it looks like taxable value increased around 4% last year. We'll see later. Income taxes, I mean, it makes sense why administrators thought that was going to take a huge hit, and it just never materialized. Maybe due to some stimulus efforts, maybe due to the fact that when people went back to work, or people went back to work sooner than expected, but they expected huge declines there, and they never happened. And on sales taxes, they're actually up, because as we're shutting down events and things, people are buying more things online, which means more taxable sales. So things are looking a lot better than they thought, and this applies to both Michigan and its local governments.
Great, thanks. So Janelle, for you, what's been going on? Obviously, there's been a series of recovery or stimulus or federal legislation, however you want to characterize it. So what's the federal government done regarding COVID, and how has that affected state tax revenue?
Yeah, great question. So there are two big bills that were aimed specifically at COVID-19 relief on the federal level. That was the CARES Act, which was back in March, and then the most recent bill that was passed in December. And in those two bills, there are two big ways that they've affected state revenues. So one is actual direct funding disbursements to states, and then the other is business and individual relief, and that's helped stabilize state and local tax collections. So the CARES Act gave $31 billion in the Education Stabilization Fund and then $25 billion in the transit and infrastructure funds. So this was targeted for specific expenses, but because these are expenses that states had probably already budgeted for, it left states free to reallocate their own education and transit money to other budget areas that needed more help. And states are often struggling right now in terms of unemployment funding, so they could use that to fund that. It also gave $150 billion in the form of the Coronavirus Relief Fund for state and city government expenses, and those are expenses that dealt directly with the public health emergency. So Michigan, in particular, received $3.9 billion of the money overall, and $3.1 billion of that was given to the state and not directly earmarked for large counties. So that's money that the state had to play with there. The most recent bill, which passed in December, it provided almost $82 billion for the Education Stabilization Fund and $14 billion for mass transit, and then $10 billion for state highways. Now, obviously, that's states as a whole and not particular states, but as was with the case with CARES, this isn't technically flexible funding in name, but it does give states some budget flexibility. Now, unfortunately, public transit is really in need of the extra funding right now, especially as people are not driving as much or they are not using public transit as much. So that probably will have to stay in most states to actually pay for transit, but everything else can be shifted around a bit. And then the relief bills also provided funding to businesses and individuals. So the CARES Act, in that we saw the Paycheck Protection Program, and the most recent bill provided that with more funding. So Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, it provides loans to first and second time small businesses borrowers, and then those loans are forgivable if they're spent on certain expenses like rent, employee retention, and things like that. CARES also allowed businesses to carry back their net operating losses instead of just carrying them forward. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, and it may seem kind of in the weeds, but it is helpful because net operating losses basically let businesses only pay taxes on their overall net income, as they have different losses and different profits year over year. So because they can carry that back this year, they don't have to wait to take advantage of that tax break, which is a really good thing. So there was also some debt relief involved for businesses in low-income communities, tax credits for employee retention, and a number of other small tweaks that have helped businesses out. So both bills did increase unemployment benefits. The first increased things by $600 a week, and the second by $300 a week. And it did provide funding to let states waive their waiting week for benefits. Usually they would have to give a little time before someone filed for unemployment and before they could pay, but that allowed them to make up the difference there. So that second category of relief that I'm talking about, the stuff that goes towards businesses and individuals, it may not directly go to states, but those actions help the economy stay afloat, and that will help stabilize income tax collections and other tax collections in states. So it won't stop revenues from seeing a drop, but it will keep things from being as bad as they could be, especially in terms of income tax collections, as those unemployment benefits are actually taxable in most states, and Michigan is one of them. So that's those are the big things.
Okay, so I want to follow up on that, though.
Yeah.
So there, for each of these federal relief bills that they're talking about, there's states are like, look, you need to bail us out. We need some more revenue to operate our state government with. And there's already been some flexibility in what's already been offered. But for Michigan, like, there's no revenue losses to backfill. You cannot bail the state of Michigan out because we didn't have revenue losses.
Yeah,
you can pile on additional money.
Several states are in the same boat there too. Yeah. A lot of states are struggling, but not every state is struggling, which is where the difficulty comes, because you run the risk of, if you fund too much in flexible funding, then they could just start sending it to things that maybe they should have planned on beforehand, and that these weren't actually problems caused by the pandemic. So yeah, there is a lot of things to think about there.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a good transition. So we're in January 2021 now. So we're going to get we have a new House taking place here in Michigan, a new state House that joins the state Senate and obviously the governor. So we have Republicans in control of the legislature. We have a Democratic governor. In Washington, we have a Democratic House, obviously a Democratic president, and a 50-50 Senate in which the vice president can provide the tiebreaker. So that being the case, what are some of the tax policy debates we can see coming, first at the state level and as well as the federal level? And I'll just let James, why don't you take that first, and you can weigh in on the state and to the extent you want to on the federal stuff.
Sure. I mean, until this pandemic is over, I think tax policy in Michigan is going to be pretty quiet. I think if if one legislative branch, or if the House had moved over to Democratic control, we would probably have that gas tax conversation again. But with it being firmly in Republican control, I don't think that's going to happen. Something that might, though, are unemployment insurance taxes. I mean, we were paying 1 million people in the state of Michigan unemployment benefits. And when we came into this pandemic with a pretty robust trust fund, that's been depleted. I'm not sure whether it's cash positive right now or not. There just aren't good reports on it that I know of. And if that goes into deficit, businesses might be slapped with an additional payroll tax. So that's something I'm concerned about. And when things are recovering, I think lawmakers are going to have that big tax debate again. The governor's most recent position is that she wants $2 billion in taxes to spend $1.2 billion on the roads. She doesn't care which tax it is. In fact, Republicans need to figure out the best tax to raise, but of course they don't have to do any of those. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And honestly, I'm just looking forward to return to normalcy and arguing about road funding like we did in the past.
And yeah, just to slightly jump off of that, James, I did check. We have a piece out on different unemployment trust funds in states, and at least from the sources that we're pulling from, I'm not seeing where that is right now, but I can get it to you later. It does look like Michigan is still a net positive in terms of the unemployment trust fund, but obviously depending on how long this lasts and how many people are on unemployment, that could change very quickly. So.
And with state policy changes like how many weeks a person is able to collect and any bonuses that lawmakers might want to add. So, I mean, right now, I think the sooner we return to a cash positive position, that is collecting more each week than we're paying out in benefits, I think at least that's what I'm looking forward to, and that
Gotcha.
will more than anything keep us from having one of these insolvency taxes levied on payroll at a time when we really want to be encouraging recovery.
Yeah, definitely.
So so it sounds like our revenue has held steady, if not increased, but we're still hearing calls for more. President-elect Biden has proposed a plan that will give a lot more money to state and local governments, maybe the most direct stimulus we've ever had. And James, we're also seeing at the local level calls to make it easier to hike taxes at the local level, to make it easier to hike the income tax at the state level. So why are these calls coming in anyways, and how should policymakers respond to that?
Okay, so local governments in Michigan have always been upset that their ability to raise revenues is limited. It is, but it's not limited by dollar values so much as the popularity of local taxes. All taxes have to be approved of by local voters, and that puts them in some constraints. That's why every problem is an excuse to revisit our constitutional limits. I doubt any of that is going to happen anytime soon. But for the most part, local governments were also in that position where they expected some big hits on their revenue, and they just didn't happen. So I think federal government really ought to be a little careful if they think that they need to rescue local governments when local governments have a tendency to overstate the fiscal harms that they're facing, and in this case, a lot of those harms just never happened.
Strikes me a little bit as a never let a good crisis go to waste type situation. But let's take a step back. So
let's give them a little bit of a thing. Like they have to make their budgets work. They were facing an unknown thing. Everyone was worried about this pandemic. And these constitutional limits they've been faced on are just a regular cause of concern for them. So I understand what they're saying, but the fears of huge reductions in their revenues just never happened.
Taking a little bit of a step back, Janelle, so anyone that saw family, Zoomed with family, whatever, probably heard from some relatives that complained about their taxes. I know that's a perpetual thing if anybody hears that I work in public policy. So where does Michigan rank in tax policy, Janelle? Are we a high tax state, a low tax state? How does that work?
So that's a really straightforward question, but the answer is not quite as straightforward because there are a bunch of different ways that you could look at that. So one way to measure it is if we're just talking simply total state and local tax collections per capita, the Michigan is actually about in the middle of the road. It's the 28th highest out of 50. Or if you want to look at it a different way, you could consider how long it would take in a given year before Michigan residents' income would surpass their tax liability. We calculate that, we call it the Tax Freedom Day. And Michigan would be done paying taxes on April 16th, which is 30th out of states. But that measure isn't really completely accurate either, as it rests a lot on average incomes in states, and federal subsidies kind of mess up those numbers. And the point is, there's more to a good tax code than just how much a state collects. It's also really important how a state collects that tax. And so every year, if you're not familiar, the Tax Foundation actually does a state business tax climate index, where every year we look at about 130 variables in state tax codes, and then we rank states on how competitive they are and how much and how simple and how neutral and how effective their tax code is. So in terms of overall score, Michigan actually ranks 14th, which is not a bad place to be. It's very competitive in its individual income taxes. It's very competitive in corporate income taxes. So yeah, that's about where Michigan's at.
So we've made some pretty big policy movement over the last 10 years. Sounds like that's helped our ranking. The government still seems to collect more revenue than most states. But James, what we hear here in the state of Michigan is that state and local governments are starved for revenue. So how do we balance what we're hearing about that? And is there areas of improvement that we can make? Are there areas where we should actually consider cutting tax?
So I know that Michigan can afford to lower its taxes if lawmakers want, because Michigan has operated with less revenue in the past. Over the past 10 years, including numbers from the pandemic, Michigan revenues are up $10 billion, which is 17% above inflation. And if we were talking about what I think is the most likely tax to be cut, the personal income tax. So Governor Granholm raised it in 2007. Lawmakers put in that law a plan to reduce it back to 3.9%, and that got canceled in 2011. And I think if you were to ask me what is the most likely tax to be cut, it would be that, to restore it or to cut taxes down to 3.9%. That would cost less than 1/10 of how much revenue has been growing. So it's clearly affordable. And in fact, when you look at lawmakers' other priorities and some other demands that have been called on Lansing lawmakers, like they want to reintroduce film incentives. Well, that was $500 million before we got rid of it. They want $300 million in other business subsidy programs. I think those are unfair and ineffective, and certainly that $300 million could be put to better use, including tax cuts if they want. So if it's a priority, if lawmakers are interested in it, I think it's certainly affordable. Whether you can convince our Governor Whitmer to sign one is a different story.
So Janelle, especially you can take this, especially from the federal side, but also what's going on with different states. So how do we classify what a good tax system is? What would make states do well in your ranking, and how do you balance that with you often hear, sure, this state has lower taxes, but obviously their government services must be worse, and this state has higher taxes, but hey, you pay for a civil society, you pay for government. How do we balance those things? What actually makes a good tax policy system?
Yeah, well, a good tax policy system is, first of all, it's going to be simple. Like, it's going to be something that people can understand, where they actually know how their taxes are levied and where they're going to. Like, that's very important. But also, rate is one thing. Like, we've all talked about tax rates, and we know that that's important. But the base is also just as important. If you're only levying taxes on a very small percent of people, or if you're trying to rely on high-income folks to take in most of your income taxes, then that is actually going to end up being a lot more volatile of a tax structure, where they can easily move or their incomes can easily change. So if you're too reliant on a very small section of society for tax revenue, that's going to make it a lot harder to budget and a lot harder to predict for your state. So it's very important that your base is broad. And because the base is broader, that usually means that you can bring down the tax rate and you can have a lower rate overall. So that's also extremely important.
So James, how do we do if it's lower rates on a broader base, and I assume we want to cover as many industries as we can. How does Michigan look, James?
Yeah, so Michigan has all the major taxes that other states have, and some states do without one. So Michigan has a sales tax, it's in the Constitution. We have an income tax. We have property taxes, obviously, and we have a select taxes on business. In Michigan, it's the corporate income tax. Other places have like gross receipts tax and other things that are specifically levied on businesses. Now, that only raises a fraction of the revenues that those other taxes do, and Michigan can't afford to live without it. It would cost the state budget $1.2 billion, which means that the businesses would be able to keep $1.2 billion of their revenue and be able to spend that on employment and business expansion. But I don't think that's the most likely. While I think that dollar for dollar provides the most discouragement to business, dollar for dollar has the most effect on economic activity, I don't think it's going to be the most likely to be reduced in the future or eliminated. And that's because people care more about tax efficiency. In this case, they care about fairness. And when we look at our 2011 reforms, which is the most recent major change in Michigan tax policy, I think people looked at that and said, look, it was a substantial reduction in business taxes and a substantial increase in taxes on households. So we probably should be looking at reducing the personal income tax out of fairness, even if I do think that it would be more effective to eliminate the state's corporate income tax.
So Janelle, you look at this, obviously, the Tax Foundation, you work across all 50 states. What are some recent tax reform efforts that you've seen going on across the nation? Anything that we can learn from, take from that would be relevant here in Michigan?
Yeah, well, many states are taking part in successful tax reforms. Arkansas, for example, has just passed the third part of their tax reform series in 2019, and they're bringing down their corporate income tax, and they're phasing that in gradually. This year, the corporate income tax dropped from 6.5 to 6.2%, and it'll end up in 5.9% in 2022, which is great. Tennessee is in a super enviable spot right now because it just finished phasing out its tax on investment and dividends income. So now it's one of the states with no income tax at all. Iowa is also phasing in some reforms that it's already started on. Most notably, it's phasing out federal deductibility, which is a part of its corporate income tax, but that helps pay down the corporate income tax rate at the same time, so they're lowering that. None of those changes directly apply to Michigan, as a lot of this isn't stuff that the state is currently working on or currently planning to work on. But the process of these changes is really worth looking at. Arkansas and Tennessee have been bringing down rates in stages, which is worth noting. This is a really good way to effect change, as it makes sure that revenue and spending can keep up with the cuts that the state wants. Tax cuts don't pay for themselves as much as we'd love them to, and states do need to make sure that they can afford tax decreases before they put them in place. One way that states do that is by using tax triggers, where they tie rate changes to certain revenue goals. And if that state reaches a goal, then they bring down the rate by so many percent. So Iowa's corporate income tax changes are also good to look at because they are simultaneously getting rid of an exemption that shouldn't be there, and then at least partially using that to pay down the top corporate rate. And then in terms of things that James was talking about, like even if the corporate income tax isn't something that can be totally eliminated because it's just not a policy priority, there are some things in the corporate income tax that the state can take a look at, even short of bringing down rates. One is the concept of full expensing, which is found in Section 168K of the Federal Income Tax Code. In other words, at the federal level, businesses can deduct the full cost of machinery and equipment in the first year that they purchase them, whereas Michigan has not conformed to that. And right now, Michigan sticks with the system where that cost has to be claimed over a number of years. So if Michigan starts to do full expensing, it will at least help businesses not have to eat those costs over a number of years and can spur businesses in that way. So that's at least one thing that Michigan can look at.
Yeah, I want to follow up on the full expensing thing. One of the things I like about that policy is that, look, you're going to recognize the full expense of business equipment eventually. You might as well allow businesses to do it in a way that decreases the taxation of business equipment. And in fact, we established a couple of years ago with our reductions in the personal property tax and the new exemptions that we are sensitive towards taxing business equipment, and I would like to see lawmakers follow through with that in the future.
So obviously, starting in a new year, in the next couple of months here, we're going to start getting some budget proposals. James, typically the House proposes something, the Senate proposes something, the governor proposes something, and you've noted that we're seeing high revenue from past year. Potentially, depending on what the federal government does, that could be way higher revenue. You could see bailouts to state and local governments. So how should lawmakers look at that? I mean, what should they actually do with that money? Just the higher money they're getting in general, and then what should they do if they get significantly more money from the federal government?
Okay, so for one, the federal government should not provide relief efforts to states that do not need relief. Okay, it just should be a natural output of this policy, and helping. You should not leverage the pandemic to solve problems that aren't related to the pandemic. And to that point, there's some more things the federal government can do, like help out with vaccine distributions and approve the next round of vaccines as soon as possible. The vaccine is more stimulus than anything else, in my opinion. But that being said, state lawmakers do not have much of a say in whether they get bailed out, regardless of whether they need a bailout or not. So if the federal government were to send a cash bomber over Lansing and drop another couple of $1 billion and say, spend this how you want to, I would say that probably the smartest thing to do would be to pay down debt. Michigan owes its school employees $33.8 billion more than they've saved. We shouldn't have done that. We're supposed to pre-fund these things. This is some of the fastest growing debt that we have. So I believe that if every dollar you pay down in that system right now will save you $3 in interest payments over the long term. I think that would help. That would help teachers and taxpayers alike, but also try and afford some of a reduction in income taxes. I think would be an interesting thing. Now, Janelle talked about triggers and some phased-in approach to income taxes. We actually have one of those in Michigan right now. It was part of the 2015 gas tax hikes that they promised that maybe sometime in the future they will cut income taxes. And there's a formula in there. It's looking pretty good. It would reduce taxes on a small margin, I believe, starting in 2 or 3 years. I didn't look that up, or don't have the details immediately at my fingertips. That's something I would like to see lawmakers make a priority, and that's something that the state can do without needing the governor's signature.
All right, so we're getting some questions in from the audience. Getting a lot of questions, so we'll do these as best we can. They didn't think I was tough enough on you guys, so here we go. So James, you said you're looking forward to getting back to talking about roads again. Once presumably, obviously, we all want to put COVID behind us. And so, first question we got: does the Mackinac Center think Michigan should improve its infrastructure, better roads, water, internet in rural areas, etc.? And if so, how would these types of things be funded? So you don't have to give a 15-minute answer on that, but best you can. And then Janelle, if he misses anything, go ahead and fill in the blanks.
Okay, so most infrastructure that gets built in the United States and in Michigan gets built under user fee principles. As in, you want a better water system, then you pay your users in their water and sewer rates. Your cell phones pay for your cell phone towers. These things stack up, and there are some ways to improve that. Roads are one of the few things where there is a lot of general taxpayer support. The question that Michigan lawmakers have been facing over the past couple of years is, if we make roads a priority, do we also need to make tax hikes a priority to pay for them? And Michigan Republicans have largely been no. We've in fact were able to bring road spending up, I believe, around $2 billion over the past decade, and with only $600 million of that being through tax hikes. So we've been able to make roads a priority without necessarily having to raise taxes to pay for them. It's going to be a question of whether they want to continue down that path in the future. I'm not sure how that's going to play out with a governor dead set on raising taxes to pay for roads and her other priorities, but we'll see going forward.
Now, James, you'll have to refresh my memory on this because I haven't looked at Michigan specifically, but if Michigan doesn't already tie its gas tax to inflation, that might be something worth looking at, where it's not really going to be a tax increase, but it'll make sure that that money isn't slowly being worth less over time.
Okay, so yes, that is part of it. I think it's going to get phased in another year or two because that was part of the 2015 tax hike as well. But actually, thank you for reminding me that I wanted to cover whether gas taxes and vehicle registration taxes are user fees. And the answer is kinda, but not really. So let me just give an example. Like gas taxes are not based on how much you use the roads; they're based on how much fuel you use. Your vehicle registration taxes are based not on how much roads you use or your access to them, but how much you paid for your vehicle. We distribute money to local governments, not based on usage, but based on a complex political formula that's only partially based on usage. We've got road debt, so like a lot of our payments for our current roads are going not for today's road repairs, but paying interest on yesterday's road repairs. We get money from the federal government to spend on highways that where that money comes from federal debt. Like user taxes are at best a loose user fee. And I think if lawmakers want to make roads a priority for taxes, they don't necessarily have to be bound by raising fuel and registration taxes.
Another thing to mention in terms of gas taxes is that they used to be a little more representative than they are now. I mean, a lot of cars are getting to be a lot more fuel efficient than they used to be. We've got electric cars on the road. So a lot of that will mess with which cars are using the road more and still possibly paying less in gas taxes. So that's another thing.
All right. So somebody says, so Janelle, you take this one. He keeps reading that there's money going to the state for COVID, and he appreciates there's provisions for small businesses. But what is this money actually going for? And what should we watch out for if we're trying to prevent the state from misusing that funding?
Yeah, I think a lot of that goes back to what we were talking about before, because there are a bunch of different categories of help in each of these different bills. And some of the funding is going directly towards, say, actually addressing the public health crisis, whether that means bulking up hospitals and stuff like that. And then part of it is dedicated funding to states for certain things that they can spend money on. But if it's things that they were going to spend money on anyway, then they can often take that money and put it somewhere else, and they can just kind of rearrange the budget that way. That can be both helpful if states are in a bind, or that is what we need to watch out for if states are already doing well, and if they can possibly just use that to make up for past mistakes that they have made and policies that they probably should have been focusing on even before the pandemic started.
So if you want to see where what money the state of Michigan has gotten under those different acts, the state does have a spreadsheet that it maintains. It's on its coronavirus virus site. I criticize a lot of what the state does on transparency, but I really like that spreadsheet. It will tell you where each part of that act goes, but it's only for the extra stimulus money. It's not for the every single dollar that the state gets from the federal government.
All right, and Craig Teal with the Citizens Research Council did post the link to that spreadsheet in there, so him and James, as often happens, are thinking alike. Another question for James. So the state began distributing these business relief grants, and they distributed them to entities like the local economic development organizations, Michigan Municipal League. How do you feel about those grants? Do you think they were handed out in a questionable manner? What's the right policy to provide relief to businesses that were forced to close?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer toward that, although it's been interesting following the federal debate about the PPP loans. So a lot of places have taken advantage of those things, or of those loans, and then have gotten criticized. And I thought that was kind of unfair because, like, look, we're offering these loans to any business that is going to keep people on their payroll, especially at a point when we're encouraging them to close down. It's really unfair to criticize a business for taking advantage of those type of things. So I know I actually support the MEDC's work in transforming some of the programs they had from expansion programs to putting it for small business lending. I don't know how much is whether or what effects that's going to have, but I think it's far less objectionable to help businesses that are struggling through state orders than it is to take money from some taxpayers and hand it out to others. For business expansion purposes.
So with the upcoming budget discussions that we talked about, one of the controversies that had happened last budget cycle was the government, the legislature tried to put some guardrails around what could be done in the executive branches. Now we've gone a full year where executive offices have obviously done some things to deal with the pandemic and closing businesses that have been much more controversial with the legislature. So we can probably expect they're going to try to put more guardrails around executive offices. But the question we got, James, is does the governor still have the ability to redirect budget funds with a line item veto? And what do you see happening in this upcoming budget fight?
So it's not necessarily through the line item veto, but the governor exercised her ability to use one of her boards, say, well, I know you budgeted for one thing in the agriculture budget, but we're actually going to spend that on another. So far, that has gone unchallenged. I think lawmakers were skeptical about challenging that. I think when you look at the language in the Constitution, the power to budget and to set budget priorities is something that is given to the legislature. So I do find those things suspicious, but it's a power that the governor has. The governor has exercised it, and it doesn't look like it's going to be challenged anytime soon. So it's something I'm very skeptical of, but it's something that exists. And I think going forward, having used that once, I think lawmakers in negotiating their priorities with the governor for the upcoming budget year is something that they're going to be sensitive to. So we'll see how that plays out.
That's a great public policy answer. We'll see. So Janelle, you talked about Tennessee fully getting rid of all income taxes. Obviously, in your state tax rankings, that's a big deal. So we have a question from someone maybe nearing retirement, but they say with this possible increased federal income taxes for individuals and states like Tennessee and others that have no income tax, do you think there will be more people moving to the no tax states, especially retirees?
I mean, there are a lot of things that go into people's decision to move, and we actually put out a map recently on this, which I can send a link to later. But I think that taxes are definitely one of the things that people take into account, especially I think retirees who have more limited ways to get income. They'll definitely be thinking of that. We saw this year that a couple of the top states, especially in terms of retirees, are states where at least Social Security income was not taxed. So that's definitely something that they're considering. I think weather was also a factor when you look at the states that they moved to. I mean, you've got Florida that's definitely in there and a bunch of other southern states, but taxes are a factor. I don't know if they're an overwhelming factor for a lot of people. I think it depends on your income and exactly how much you're concerned about that, but it's definitely a factor.
My colleague Mike Lefebvre actually has a model that he worked on with Michael Hicks about exactly how much of a factor they are. One thing that always disappoints me about that model is that days of sunshine seems to matter, and we live in a cloudier area than I was expecting.
All right, so James, especially here in the state level of Michigan, what's been the trend of government benefit costs in the past couple years? Have changes occurred to reduce future costs of the state? What impact has that had on the state budget? What kind of pressure are we going to see for the future?
So the biggest question going for the state in the future is going to be how much Medicaid costs. I mean, it covers so many people in the state of Michigan. The federal government covers a lot of those costs, which makes it a little bit more difficult for state lawmakers to get a handle on this. But it's the primary driver. It's the biggest game in town right now. And it's also something that's kind of in the least amount of control of legislators. So it's grown from something that's around $2 billion a year to $10 billion a year. So much of our revenue is going to that. And those are numbers just off the top of my head. I'd have to look them up in total. But how we help people who can't pay for medical care is an important question going forward. And it's something that we're going to spend some more time on here at the Mackinac Center.
All right, let's do our last question here. So for both of you, Colorado has something like the TABOR, Taxpayer Bill of Rights, limits revenue growth of the state with population inflation. So how does that work, and is that something that Michigan can or should consider?
So in Michigan, we already have some of the elements from the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. In fact, I was talking with a colleague, our mutual colleague, Ben DeGrow, used to work for the Independence Institute in Colorado, and one of his friends was on the Taxpayer Bill of Rights committee. And his favorite part of that law was not the restrictions to population and inflation, but rather asking voters to approve any increase in taxes. And I think that's an important thing because it ensures that there is popular control of tax policy, which is something, that's what led to the taxpayer revolt of the 70s in the first place. So we've got some elements to it. One of the things that they have that we do not is they tie state spending to population and inflation, which is a much stricter limit than the state of Michigan's personal income. And the state restrictions are nowhere near its limits and not going to be for the foreseeable future. So that's something that lawmakers can discuss, or at least if they do think it's important to limit state tax revenues, to revisit the personal income limitation.
Thank you both. Thank you for our panelists. Thank you for the attendees. This was one of our most popular events that we've had in terms of attendance. So people are really interested in the intricacies of tax policy, I guess, or at least just want to see, am I going to get a higher tax this year? So we appreciate it. The Mackinac Center is a 501c3. We're a nonprofit organization. Please continue to check out these events. If you'd like to learn more about our publications, we produce research. We have a legal firm. We have a news website. Lots of free publications and information. And if you'd like to support us, you can check us out at mackinac.org. We have upcoming events that you can also sign up for if you enjoyed this one. The next one is on how COVID lockdowns have affected the economy, the costs and benefits of that. We have one coming up about the cost of college and whether free college is a good idea. And as I said, please share these with your friends and family. They're all on our website at mackinac.org. Right at the top, you click events. If you are interested in getting more involved, we also ask that you check out our Opportunity Michigan network. This is a network of people who are interested in staying really up to date on public policy going on in the state and with opportunities to contact their lawmakers, write op-eds, get involved in a variety of different ways. So if you're interested in any of that, check us out at mackinac.org, and we'll see you at the next event. Thank you.